Before dawn in a quiet Sydney suburb, workers scraping at the earth for a routine job unearthed something no one expected. Beneath the soil, hidden for months, were tiny bones wrapped in decaying cloth, once belonging to infants far too young to have lived. These were not graves marked with stones or remembered in family plots, but shallow burials in a suburban backyard, forgotten, neglected, and horribly silent. The discovery sent a chill through the community. Two bodies, then more. With each spade of soil turned, another piece of a grim puzzle was revealed. What kind of world sees the smallest and most vulnerable buried like refuse behind the homes of the living? And how many more might lie hidden beneath the gardens of houses long since changed? In an era when society looked the other way at the plight of its poorest and most desperate, a dark undercurrent was running through the streets of Sydney, one built on desperation, secrecy, and the silent deaths of children. This is a story about desperate times, dangerous choices, and lives cut tragically short, a case that would shock a city, divide a nation, and leave a legacy of sorrow. This is the chilling case of John and Sarah Makin, and the babies who never had a chance, in the year 1892. Sydney, the burgeoning capital of New South Wales, pulses with the promise and peril of a growing colonial city. Behind the facade of bustling streets and grand buildings lay poverty, hardship, and a society struggling with systemic inequality. Infant mortality is high, especially among the children of unmarried mothers who faced ostracism, shame, and little support. In this world, alternatives for a destitute mother were limited: family care, institutional orphanages, or the emerging and unregulated practice known as baby farming. A woman advertising for someone to care for her illegitimate child might receive responses promising compassion and a safe home for a fee. Without oversight or record keeping, baby farming became a shadow industry, predicated on a fragile trust and the most vulnerable of lives. Some caregivers offered genuine support. Others saw opportunity. In a city racked by economic struggle and moral stigma, the arrangements that emerged to meet human need also laid bare the potential for exploitation. In the end, the public would learn that one couple's business was built not on care, but on calculated cruelty. John and Sarah Makin were not the only baby farmers in Sydney. But by the time the police uncovered what they had done, the scale of their crimes would eclipse every other case. What authorities found would reveal a chilling truth about desperation, deceit, and the darkest possibilities of human behavior. John Sidney Makin was born in 1845, the fourth of 11 children on a farm near Dapto, New South Wales. He grew up in modest circumstances, the son of a working family in a colony still finding its feet. Sarah Jane Sutcliffe, also born in 1845, came into the world in the bustling port city of Sydney, the daughter of a miller and a former convict. Their early lives offered little hint of the horror to come. They married in Sydney in 1871, and over the years built a large family of their own, 5 sons and 5 daughters. Though they struggled to make ends meet, like many working-class families of the era, there was hope in steady work and mutual support. John labored as a drayman, hauling goods for hire, and Sarah took on midwifery and domestic work to supplement the family's income. But several turning points would soon change that life of modest struggle into something far darker. After a work-related injury left John unable to maintain regular employment, the pair were forced to look for alternative sources of income. For a time, they answered newspaper advertisements from unmarried mothers in distress, women desperate to find homes for their children in a society that offered them little compassion. In the unregulated world of 1890s Australia, caring for infants in exchange for a fee was not itself criminal. It was a form of income known as baby farming, essentially taking responsibility for an illegitimate child on payment of a premium and weekly support. With no government oversight or registration requirements, such arrangements often depended entirely on trust. Many who engaged in it saw it as a way to help those in need while earning a living. For the Makins, it began innocently enough. They took in infants for modest payments, at first appearing to offer care where few others would. But neighbors often remarked on their frequent relocations, as the family moved repeatedly between rental homes across Sydney, Redfern, McDonaldtown, Chippendale, often owing rent or seeking cheaper lodgings. As the Makin household grew with more children under their care, both their own and those entrusted to them, the line between caregiving and exploitation blurred. What had started as a means of survival became something far more sinister, a calculated scheme in which infants were taken in for payment and never seen again. This was not merely a struggling couple offering help. These were people who learned to weaponize a desperate mother's hope for profit. And behind the smiles and reassurances were decisions that would cost innocent lives. In the years before their crimes were uncovered, the Makins had moved from house to house, leaving behind more questions than answers, until the earth itself revealed what had been buried beneath. In the late 19th century, child welfare systems, as we know them today, did not exist. There were no licensed adoption agencies, no child welfare inspectors, no social services to support struggling mothers. Instead, a marketplace grew around infant care, one rooted in desperation and ambiguity. Baby farming was the term given to the practice of taking custody of an infant or very young child in exchange for payment. A mother, often unmarried and without family support, would place an advertisement in the newspaper seeking someone to care for her baby. In response, individuals or couples would offer to board or even adopt the child, receiving either a lump sum payment or a weekly stipend to feed, clothe, and raise the infant. In theory, this arrangement promised relief for a struggling mother and a source of income for the caregiver. But in practice, it was a system with minimal oversight and no proper record keeping. There were no standard contracts, no government-issued licenses, no regular inspections. Once a baby left its mother's arms and entered the care of a baby farmer, few mechanisms existed to ensure its well-being. For many mothers, the choice to place their child in someone else's care was not a preference. It was survival. The social stigma of having a child out of wedlock could ruin reputations and reduce a woman's ability to find employment. With little legal protection and almost no institutional support, baby farming seemed like a discreet, if imperfect, solution. But the lack of regulation created fertile ground for exploitation. Some caregivers genuinely attempted to provide care, but were overwhelmed by the sheer number of infants entrusted to them and the inadequate payments they received. Others saw an opportunity. If a child cost money to feed and clothe, then ending that child's life soon after receiving payment meant keeping the fee without ever providing ongoing care. In such a climate, tragedy was almost inevitable. Infants might be neglected, starved, or left in unsanitary conditions. In extreme cases, as Sydney would soon witness, those entrusted with care turned deadly, hiding their crimes beneath the very roofs and gardens where they had promised safety. For desperate mothers, baby farming was a hopeful gamble. For some infants, it became a death sentence. In the case of John and Sarah Makin, baby farming was not simply a flawed social practice. It became a mechanism of malice, turning the vulnerability of society's most helpless into a calculated source of profit. In the winter of 1892, Amber Murray, just 18 years old, faced a decision no young mother should ever have to make. Unable to care for her newborn son, Horace Amber Murray, she placed an advertisement in the Sydney Morning Herald in search of a motherly person who would take her child into their care in exchange for a small fee. It was a plea born of hardship, not want of love. Among those who responded was a seemingly kind couple calling themselves Mr. and Mrs. Hill, in truth John and Sarah Makin, operating under an alias. They promised warmth and safety, claiming they had recently lost a child of their own. They offered to raise Horace as if he were theirs, and assured Amber that she could visit him whenever she wished. Reassured by their words, she entrusted her son to their care after paying an upfront sum of £3 and agreeing to regular weekly payments. At first, the arrangement seemed benign, but soon Amber's attempts to see her son were met with excuses. Each time she asked to visit Horace, the Makins offered another reason why it could not be arranged. They told her they were relocating to a better environment, promising to forward their new address once settled, a promise that was never kept. As the weeks passed with no sign of the promised visit, Amber's worry grew into fear. Determined to find her child, she attempted to locate the Makins herself, only to discover they had moved quietly from their Redfern home to another part of Sydney, leaving no trace of where Horace might be. Her panic turned to dread when the police, following an unrelated discovery of infant remains buried in a backyard where the Makins had once lived, began to investigate the couple's past addresses. Amber was brought forward as a witness, her voice trembling as she identified items of clothing she had made for Horace among the belongings recovered by authorities. What began as a mother's desperate search for help became the first real crack in a case that would expose one of the most horrifying crimes in Sydney's history. Not a failing of a system, but a calculated betrayal of trust that would ultimately shake a city and change how society viewed the vulnerable. The discovery in the backyard at 25 Burren Street, McDonaldtown, did not sit easily with authorities. What began as a shocking find by workmen quickly drew police attention when two infant bodies were uncovered buried beneath the earth. At first, investigators could not be certain who might be responsible, but the relief workers' report triggered something far larger. Detectives attempted to trace the occupants of the house. They soon learned that the previous tenants, a man and woman who had given only false names, had moved on. Senior Constable James Joyce and his team began examining tenancy records and discovered that this couple, John and Sarah Makin, had not stayed in one place for long. They had lived in multiple rented homes across Sydney over the preceding months, always departing before anyone could raise alarm. As police followed the paper trail through Redfern, McDonaldtown, and later Chippendale, they realized the Makins had not only eluded them with constantly changing addresses, but seemed to leave a troubling pattern in their wake. Other neighbors began coming forward, sharing how children had been entrusted to the couple, and how, like Amber Murray's Horace, they had vanished. The investigation was no longer about one grave. It was about an escalating sequence of suspicion and unanswered questions. When police returned to 25 Burren Street with shovels, the full scale of what lay beneath became horrifyingly clear. What had once been two buried infants quickly became seven as detectives and workmen unearthed shallow graves, each one containing the remains of a child, wrapped in cloth, buried just beneath the garden soil. For forensic experts and investigators alike, the scene was gut-wrenching. Each tiny skeleton told the same tragic story. Lives ended before they truly began, and buried without ceremony or acknowledgement. The discovery halted the investigation in its tracks as police began to understand that these were not isolated tragedies. They were signs of something far more systematic. With gravity and compassion, authorities documented each find, aware that every piece of evidence was not merely a statistic, but the remains of a child whose life had been entrusted to another. It was this grave, literally and metaphorically, that shifted the inquiry from rumor to a full-blown criminal case. The police did not stop at one yard. Using rental records, interviews, and leads from neighbors and witnesses, detectives began digging into every property the Makins had occupied over the past few years. What they uncovered was chilling. Tiny graves in backyards from McDonaldtown to Redfern and beyond. In Redfern, another home where the Makins had lived revealed yet more infant remains, some buried under recently disturbed earth that pointed to desperate attempts to hide evidence. At George Street and Alderson Street, bones were found just below the surface, each telling a silent but unmistakable story. Even as police worked meticulously, the count continued to rise. Tiny pits, bundles of cloth, fragments of bone. Each discovery added mounting pressure on the investigation. What began as a shocking backyard find was now a trail of death across Sydney, with at least 15 infant bodies unearthed on properties where the Makins had once lived. By March 1893, the case against John and Sarah Makin had become more than a local scandal. It was a courtroom spectacle that gripped Sydney and challenged the limits of Victorian-era justice. The Central Criminal Court was packed to capacity each day, with crowds lining the corridors and word of the proceedings spreading rapidly through the press and public alike. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense and emotional. Mothers, journalists, and curious onlookers filled the gallery as testimony after testimony painted a harrowing picture. Among them were women who recounted, with heartbreak and anger, how they had lovingly entrusted their infants to the Makins, only to watch them vanish without explanation. One witness, Amber Murray, identified the clothing found on an infant's remains as items she had dressed her son in before giving him to the Makins. Medical experts called to the stand detailed the grim findings from the exhumed graves. Though decomposition made exact causes of death difficult to determine, investigators reported bloodstains on infant clothing, and the sheer number of bodies buried at multiple addresses linked directly to the accused. Prosecutors methodically laid out evidence of deception, fraud, and cruelty, documenting how the Makins had accepted payment from desperate mothers, provided inconsistent or false addresses, and repeatedly refused legitimate requests for updates or visits. They presented the jury with a pattern of behavior that transcended neglect and entered the realm of calculated malice. Despite efforts by the defense to frame the couple as well-meaning child carers operating in a flawed social system, the evidence proved overwhelming. Witness after witness testified, and the weight of forensic and testimonial proof collapsed the Makins' defense under its own gravity. After intense testimony and days of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. John and Sarah Makin were found guilty of murder, specifically for the killing of infant Horace Amber Murray. The jury recommended mercy for Sarah Makin, but the verdict was nonetheless decisive. The presiding judge, Justice Matthew Henry Stephen, addressed the court before sentencing. He condemned the Makins' actions in stark terms, outlining how they had beguiled a grieving mother, hidden their true addresses, and buried the child as you would the carcass of a dog, citing the multiple burial sites uncovered across Sydney as testament to their deceit and cruelty. Both defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, the ultimate punishment under New South Wales law at the time. While the jury had recommended mercy for Sarah, her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment by executive decision. For society at large, the case became a mirror reflecting broader systemic failures. Poverty, social stigma against unwed mothers, and a lack of institutional support that left women with few safe options. The tragedy underscored that desperation can drive individuals to take unthinkable risks in the hope of giving their children some chance at life. At the same time, it revealed how the absence of regulation can enable exploitation to flourish unchecked, with catastrophic consequences. In the years that followed, child welfare reforms gradually took more concrete shape. Authorities began to take greater responsibility for monitoring those who cared for children, and public awareness of the dangers of unregulated baby farming grew. Though it would take decades for modern adoption and child protection systems to evolve fully, the Makin case marked a pivotal turning point in the conversation around how society cares for its most vulnerable. What of the Makin's own surviving children? When police arrested the family in 1892, their youngest child, 2-year-old Cecil, was taken into the care of a neighbor. Sarah and John's other children, sons and daughters born before the crimes came to light, survived their parents' infamy. After serving nearly 2 decades behind bars, Sarah Makin was released on parole in 1911 following petitions from her daughters, and she later lived with her children before her death in 1918. 3 sons and 4 daughters outlived her, bearing the legacy of their parents in a world that had never fully forgotten the case. As this chapter of history fades into the annals of the past, it is the unnamed victims who should remain at the forefront of our memory. The infants buried in shallow graves, their lives ended before they truly began. These were children entrusted to the care of others, and the betrayal of that trust is a stain that time cannot wash away. Their stories remind us that desperation met cruelty in a society unprepared to protect both the vulnerable and the desperate. It is a cautionary tale of what can happen when social systems fail those in need, and when oversight and compassion lag behind human suffering. John and Sarah Makin profited from innocence and buried their crimes beneath the soil of Sydney. Their names may linger in history books, but it is the echoes of the lives they took that should remain with us. Today, their case remains one of the darkest chapters in Australia's criminal history, a chapter marked not just by the killer's actions, but by society's reckoning with its own failures. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more historical true crime cases, be sure to subscribe for future episodes and comment below with your thoughts or questions about this chilling case.